Welcome to the Empowered Living Zone, where you can create the life you crave. With me, Dr. A, as a psychologist for over 30 years, a transformational life coach, and an expert in self-empowerment, my life's work has been inspired by the beautifully powerful resilience of the human spirit. We will share stories and successes of people who have not only overcome personal adversity, but used their traumas and hardships as a springboard into greatness. Create positive transformational shifts on your way to achieving phenomenal success. Get ready to level up as you move beyond the challenging terrain of your life's journey into the empowered living zone. Ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision, the Empowered Living Zone show starts now. I'm Dr. A, and you are listening to the Empowered Living Zone on Transformation Talk Radio. And with me today is my guest, Dr. Pat Baccili. Dr. Pat is an international award-winning talk radio host, TV commentator, certified career and belief coach, dynamic seminar leader, and inspirational speaker, award-winning author and researcher, and the CEO and owner of a successful inspirational company, Unlimited Possibilities Now. Dr. Pat is well respected in her various roles in the human potential field, and she has received numerous awards for her empowering message on the radio. I'm deeply grateful and honored to have Dr. Pat join me today. Welcome, Dr. Pat.
It's great to be here. And we're going to be talking about something I think that's so globally important today. And it's one of the things I think once they hear you describe it, everybody is going to say, wow, that sounds like me, right?
Exactly, Dr. Pat. As a matter of fact, what I was thinking about, and let me back up a little bit. I had the wonderful honor of presenting Imposter Syndrome to the Koalas group of Colorado. That's basically the Colorado Association of Latin American administrators and superintendents. And I want to share a little bit about that experience, Dr. Pat, because it's so telling about this challenge that many of us have. I am in a room, and I tell you, this was standing room only for my presentation on imposter syndrome. I am speaking to leaders, superintendents, and administrators for schools in the state of Colorado, and this is a standing room only event. And I think what it does is it just speaks to the reality that all of us suffer from imposter syndrome. So I would imagine as listeners are listening to our message today, everybody's heard this term, or most everybody's heard this term. And as a matter of fact, this is so common. I was looking at research, and research shows that as high as 84% of individuals suffer from imposter feelings at one time or another. These are CEOs, these are owners of companies, these are leaders, administrators. Everybody suffers from this. And I want to make it really clear because in some ways, as a matter of fact, right now as we're speaking, the current climate around this is there's actually talk about changing the name, because syndrome implies that there's something wrong with somebody. Like syndrome sounds so clinical. And quite frankly, imposter syndrome is not a clinical diagnosis. And it is not an indication that something's wrong with you. And so there's been kind of a push to change the label from imposter syndrome to imposter feelings because it is so prevalent. And so I just want to let the listeners know about that. So what are we talking about? What exactly does it mean? And like I said, I think all of us are familiar with this, and we've had moments where we felt this. And I want to distinguish it from a couple of other things. Imposter syndrome is not anxiety, because imposter syndrome is a specific experience around someone's perceptions of their own talents, qualifications, competence, where anxiety is much more of a general experience. It's also not an issue around self-esteem, because self-esteem and self-value is much more of a global experience of how we value ourselves, where imposter syndrome is very specific, again, to our belief about our abilities, about our competency, about our experience, our expertise. And so the number one component of imposter syndrome is believing that you are less qualified, less competent, less intelligent, less educated than what you think other people think about you. So that's one thing. The second thing that's really interesting is that a lot of times people who struggle from imposter syndrome, they're very quick to dismiss their achievements. They'll say things like, oh, it was luck, or, oh, it just worked out for me, or, you know what, anybody could do this. Yet at the same time, this is kind of like very interesting. They're very quick to blame themselves for any perceived, shortcomings. So I find that really fascinating. But that's not just those aren't the only elements of imposter syndrome. A very important piece of imposter syndrome is there is some anxiety or panic might be a better word, of being found out, of being discovered as a fraud or as an imposter, meaning, okay, I've been able to maintain this ruse of being smarter than I really am, or more qualified than I really am. And so when opportunities present themselves where the light might be shown on you, there's a little bit of a panic, like, oh my gosh, what if somebody discovers that I really am not as smart as they think I am, or that maybe I'm not as qualified as they think I am. So that's really at the core of imposter syndrome.
Yeah. And one of the things I want to point to, and I'm not sure exactly where I am with changing the name, although I do understand it, it can be a really core part of a subconscious driver that puts you out of a game. Now, how does it show up? We're going to talk about that. I know I have my own little story, but there are many people that you know in the world, that actors, let's say, let's start with that, actors that you wouldn't believe it in a million years if you knew the roles that they turned down, right? Because they just didn't think they were good enough to play it. And if you heard the names of these people, you'd be like, what? What? Julia Roberts? What did she do? Scarlett Johansson? What did they turn down? Did they really think they weren't good enough? See, imposter syndrome doesn't have any boundary or border on who it affects. It doesn't.
You're absolutely right. And it would be surprising, like you said, it's shocking to discover just who can struggle with this. It's anybody. And, I would love to hear, I'm going to share my story, Dr. Pat, around imposter syndrome, and I'd love to hear yours.
Sure.
Because I think it's very powerful. I shared this when I did the presentation for Koalas, and I started off with, when I was in high school, my graduating class was 683 students, and I was ranked 10th out of 683. I went to DU undergrad on a full ride scholarship. And then, even though I was dissuaded to apply to graduate school, because I was told DU never accepts its own into their graduate programs, I not only was only one of 5 out of 300 applicants that got into the program, but as an undergrad, I graduated Phi Beta Kappa, summa cum laude. I had a 3.9 GPA. I get into graduate school. I have straight A's in graduate school. I graduate with honors. And it wasn't until I was sitting in my pre-doctoral internship program, I was at a meeting at 29 years old. and there was this woman who ended up being my friend for over 30 years, was talking very matter-of-factly about her intelligence. And in that moment, I was like, wait a minute, I'm following this. I'm not having any trouble. I'm keeping up. Not only am I keeping up, I'm contributing to this conversation. And it didn't matter. My accomplishments did not matter. They did not register because I believed that I was less intelligent. I believed that I was less competent. And my accolades did not even hit the radar screen. But it was in that moment at 29 years old that for the first time I had acknowledged this possibility that I actually might have some intelligence. So that's my story, Dr.
Yeah.
Pat. I would love to hear yours.
Well, I love to, of course, I'll talk about mine, but I often think about how this shows up for people. And if you read stories about people that make decisions about their lives, their careers, sometimes you have to read in between the lines, right, as to whether it was really imposter syndrome or something else, right? It's hard to imagine. But when you hear like prominent people, when you hear people that maybe are everyday household names for folks here in the United States, like Will Smith turned down the role of Neo in The Matrix. What? Why? Right? But in the end, if you understand the laws of the universe, Keanu Reeves just rocked that. But you see, how do we know imposter syndrome is working? How do we know it's working in us? And what I mean by that is, are we aware, or what can we learn today from the show that will give you hints? Okay, my story, I've got a bunch, but here's the one. This is the one I really had to go get help from. Graduated from Claremont. Research won a million gazillion awards. Not really. They won a couple awards, but the research got cited over and over again, because nobody had studied this. But it was very commonsensical to me. It was like, why hasn't anybody ever studied psychological contracts between two people? Well, because they study it between an organization and a person. I said, no, an organization is a nothing. We already know how that feels. We don't look at organizations as anything but mostly at the time corrupt, downsized people. So I studied that, and I somehow was able to figure out how to study it. So I finished, blah, 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 get rid of school, graduate. I'm up on the stage, get my 3 years after my final postdoctorate paper, for 3 years, I can't remember how many times the same reoccurring dream. See, this is an indicator that you got a little bit of this going on. Second indicator is I couldn't take any jobs. I wasn't really I couldn't accept any consulting jobs. I had a million reasons why I didn't. But the dream tipped me off, because if I take that job, they're really going to find out about me. They're going to really find out that I didn't really graduate from that school. Every night, the same dream. And I'm telling you, it was almost to the T, the same dream of what I remembered. I'm walking up on the stage to get the thing, the degree, like you do. You get up there, they give you your degree. And right before my hands are on it, the head of the college's hands are on it. Both of our hands are on it. And one of the people on my committee who never liked me, I actually booted him off of my dissertation committee, jumps up and says, no, she can't graduate. She's 3 credits short. Every dream for a lot of nights for 3 years. And then you really take a look at why, and you discover what that's about. You see, you discover that that's not even reality, because you did graduate. And by the way, everything about that, your dissertation, but that doesn't make imposter syndrome any less real. And I think this is the important part of what we're talking to people about. People that really go through this, there's a reality that happens unless you get some help, right? Unless you can figure this out. That if I didn't work through that, I wouldn't be here today. I am pretty sure I wouldn't be on air. I wouldn't own a network. I wouldn't be helping thousands of people launch their dream had I not really gotten an understanding of that, because the dream was just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and Dr. Pat, while you're not saying these words, you're speaking to something that's very important. In spite of imposter syndrome, in spite of the fear that we don't deserve a seat at the table, we still do amazing things. And that just speaks. I mean, that speaks to the premise of our message here on the Empowered Living Zone is you can't stop that power. You can't stop that personal power in terms of creating and bringing our gifts into the world, even in the face of imposter syndrome. And so I think you hit that nail on the head very well there, Dr. Pat. I'm not sure if you meant to, but that was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're gonna take a quick break. And when we come back, we're actually going to talk about where does this come from? Why is it that we have this? What fuels these feelings, these imposter feelings? You are listening to the Empowered Living Zone with Dr. A and Dr. Pat, and we'll be right back. We are back on the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. A, and Dr. Pat. And today we're talking about imposter syndrome, which is interesting. It seems like it's getting a lot of traction lately. I've seen it in lots of places all over the place. And it is a very prevalent thing. It's interesting as you and I are having this conversation, Dr. Pat, of course, I have a tendency to go to the why. Well, why is this here? Where does this come from? Why does it even happen to begin with? And what's really interesting, I find this really fascinating, is research overall has shown, and as a matter of fact, the reason that imposter syndrome was ever a thing and was actually studied in the late 70s was because of this phenomenon that they were seeing with women in particular. So they were looking at differences, gender differences with men and women in confidence, and the prevalence with which women, when they were in same situations, like, for example, they looked at a study with a male and female Ph.D. candidates and in Ph.D. programs, and they noticed this trend where women tended to underestimate their ability. They tended to, contribute less and share less. And this is actually what stimulated the study of imposter syndrome to begin with. And so when we think about the why or where this comes from, it's really important to look at these kinds of elements. And we're going to get into it a little bit. I want to make sure that listeners hear that this is a universal challenge and experience. Yeah. And at the same time, there are particular groups that may experience it a little bit more or a lot more than other groups because of societal expectations, implicit bias, and those kinds of things.
Well, I mean, before you talk about it, let's just be very clear for people that it shows up in different ways. For example, and you're always going to hear me do actor references because that's what I think people can relate to at a large level. But when Claire Danes turned down the role of Rose in Titanic, which went to Kate Winslet, when she turned that down, what she talked about later was she turned it down. She said because she didn't have it in her to take the part, and deal with the fame. Now, what is that really saying? I didn't interview her. I don't know her. But when you think about that, what are you really saying? Because you became an actor, and Claire Danes played a great actor. But that one role, a James Cameron movie, Rose, Titanic, And you hear this over and over again. And the reason I bring up actors because we think there are sections of people that have got this down. And we're all the same when it comes to this. It depends on what part of us it hits, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, nobody's exempt, right? And it is shocking. It is surprising because you would think that actors, this is what they do for a living, is that they're in front of people and they're performing and they're perfecting their gift. And yet they even are struck with these kinds of feelings and they can come from, like you said, they can be really unpredictable and come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
What I find interesting about this too, Dr. Pat, is I think about, oh my goodness, our inner critic has a heyday with this. I mean, it's like they're cousins, they're colluding, you get a little that feeling of, oh my goodness, and let me tell you, I see this all the time. If I were to tell you, I work with a lot of women in leadership roles, and what I will tell you is this is in the top 3, by the way, in the top 3 challenges for my clients and working with women in leadership roles. And what I'm really struck by is how quickly they will say something like, they're coming up for a promotion and they will say, oh, well, I don't have this degree, or I don't have enough education, or I don't have enough experience. And the moment they say that, the inner critic kind of perks up and goes, oh, here's the door open for me, and goes right in there. And you were talking about, how do we know? I mean, one of the things that is really important is that we have self-awareness. We have to be aware that there is this dialogue going on in our head. And the dialogue could be between the imposter feelings and our inner critic. Our inner critic is going to amplify perceived inadequacies and downplay accomplishments. And so if we're not aware of this, before we know it, we've talked ourselves out of a lot of things, just like you were sharing with these actors who talk themselves out of these amazing roles. They talk themselves out of it because of these imposter feelings. And I wouldn't be surprised if the inner critic doesn't just jump right in to join the conversation.
I think our inner critic does that every chance it gets. And the reason we're talking about it today, and congratulations on doing that talk. And that's how you know when something is so prominent in both the subconscious and the conscious part of let's just call it, who we are as individuals. It's showing up a lot for a lot of reasons. I want to ask you this question about it because I was really struck by something you said earlier, and I've been thinking about it now for about 20 minutes. And I just wonder why, right? I got the why. Now, forget all the actors and all those people. Just put them over there. Like, go over there with the actors for a minute because they have a million reasons why or why not they say yes. But how about us individuals? And I just did a show recently on social media. And I hate to put it in 2 words, social media, but I just don't know what else to call it. I also put YouTube in there. I put any form of media that is a form of engagement for people, that is an open form. And I thought about this. I wonder if we're not just in this imposter syndrome, but we're now adding another layer to it, which I can't name at the moment, but another layer of it to what would happen to us if we really came out. And it's even in jobs. I mean, when you go on an interview for a job, they go through social media. If they find any picture of you whatsoever about anything, they're going to know it. But do you think that perhaps the more visibility we now have, whether we want it or not, do you think that plays a role in all this?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it plays a gigantic role in it, Dr. Pat. And here's what I think the mechanism is around that is, the bottom line with imposter syndrome is we're going to be found out, right? That's the bottom line, is somebody's going to figure out that we're not as good as that we're letting everybody believe that we are, or we're we've got this charade going on. When you think about social media, our audience has increased exponentially. We are no longer in the privacy of a conference room. We're no longer just one-on-one with somebody. Our visibility has increased exponentially. And I think because of that, our fear of humiliation, our fear of, like I said, being found out as a fraud, it's not going to stay in the room. It's going to be everywhere. And I think it's amplified our fears. And I think this is why this is part of our conversation, not only in our conversation today, yours and mine, Dr. Pat, but if just get on different kinds of outlets. You see imposter syndrome everywhere. And I think it's up because it's in the culture right now because of social media. These fears are amplified and they do become real. I mean, just look at even cancel. Look at, this whole phenomenon of cancel culture. You make a mistake and you're done.
Yeah.
And so I think those kinds of experiences where things are no longer private, they're very, very public in a very big way. Not only is that happening, but our biggest fears are actually being realized. People are canceled. People are humiliated on social media. And so I think it's amplifying this fear of being found out.
Yeah. I mean, and you're so right about it. It shows up in multiple places. And I know we're going to talk about this, but I think you said it earlier. There may be something that will happen to us as an adult that's deeply grounded in a scenario when we were younger, right? Now, why would I have a reoccurring dream about something that was never going to happen? I graduated, I beyond fulfilled the requirements, wrote a dissertation that won awards, so that was never going to be the reality of that situation. So the question then comes, what was it from my life experiences that kept telling me you're an imposter? What was it? How can that one accomplishment cancel out years of conditioning that so many people get? We find it in sports. We find it in kids early on that play in sports, right? And they go through experience of it. You either make it or you're not. And if you don't make it, what do you do with that? You're a young kid and you're playing sports. I don't care what the sport is. It could be football, basketball, baseball, soccer. Did I leave anything out? Table tennis. It doesn't matter now pickleball. It doesn't matter what it is. But you go through the world and how these things are addressed with you as a younger person can sculpt the way you develop as to how you want to be in the world, don't you think?
Yes. And as I sit here with this phenomenon, I think that the reason it's so hard to kind of beat is I believe it evolves from other things. You're looking at programming from the moment you're walking and talking. I think about my own experience, and this lends really well to this conversation. I grew up in a home where there was lots of criticism. There was the only thing that was communicated to me in words or actions was when I believe I messed up. I was in trouble, and so I got this constant message in my home that I was not good enough. I got the constant message in my home that I was a failure. So guess what that led to for me? I became a perfectionist. And perfectionism is something that feeds the fire of imposter syndrome. And it's not just that. It's not just families. You can look at, I want to bring it back to social media. Social media has made this comparison drama even bigger. One of the things that I often say is compare and despair. We're always comparing. There's going to always be somebody that is better than we are at everything. And I think when it's in our face, what ends up happening is it just puts into motion all of these mechanisms that feed imposter syndrome, whether it's I'm not good enough, whether it's I need to be perfect in order to have value, whether it's I want to be able to be at the table with everybody else, and it just amplifies those. And if we even want to zoom out further, I think it's important to look at imposter syndrome in a larger social context. We want to look at our culture. We want to look at things like biases based on gender, based on skin color, based on socioeconomic status. When I was sharing my story, Dr. Pat, it's like, well, how did I get there? Well, let me tell you how I got there. I can remember being a little girl and being in first grade and second grade and third grade. I was always put in the back of the classroom. I was the only brown girl in a class of white kids. And when I asked a question, I was labeled as a problem child. And so I learned to blend into the woodwork. I learned not to speak. I learned not to contribute. And so that added to my self-concept. My self-concept was I wasn't enough of anything. I wasn't smart enough. I wasn't pretty enough. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't talented enough. I wasn't athletic enough. And those feelings of not enoughness, I believe, were at my core, the core that fueled my own imposter struggles.
I love doing this and talking to you about this because there are different sides to it, right? There are so many things, but your story where this was not just incidental. This is a pattern of how we treated people of color. Just putting it, whatever that means to you, people that were not white. Mm-hmm. You can fill in your own blank, but that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And we didn't do it at an unconscious level, but the messaging seeped in, wired us. And in order to move beyond that, back of the room, asking the questions, you have had to really either had incredible support outside of the classroom or a lot of therapy or both. But look at us, both of us talking about this. What's our field? Hello, it's psychology, right? Because there were so many things I didn't understand, not just about myself, but about the world and about people. I didn't understand the nature of why people couldn't keep promises. So I studied promise. Psychological contracts are promises. I studied those for 10 years, and I still can't tell you why we do it. But I do have an understanding of it. You see, are we on this journey now where we have to be now acutely aware of how we think, why we think it, and what the impact of that is? Because it's almost like we don't teach that in school that I know of. And yet you have to be more acutely aware of it so you can be your true nature, or you will fall in the trap. See, imposter syndrome is a trap. And I think we need to talk about it like that. It sounds like a really cool thing, but it's not. It's a prison, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think about it as shackles. It shackles
I do too.
us. Again, I believe so strongly in the power of human spirit. Is even shackled, we still create and achieve amazing things. Imagine if we weren't shackled. The boundaries are limitless. But even with the shackles, we still do amazing things, and I love that. I love that about who we are as humans. Yet it doesn't take away from the reality of how these things can create such strong barriers for us. And some of these, basically what we do is we internalize what our experiences are. You're sharing your experience. I'm sharing my experience. Neither one of us knew what was going on when we were kids.
Not at all.
So we personalize that, I'm not enough. And then as we've gotten older, and you made a comment about how did we do this? Was it either a lot of support or a lot of therapy? I will tell you, for me, it was a lot of therapy in terms of having to learn, because I think one of the biggest challenges that I see with my clients, and I think this is where the rubber meets the road, is I will keep hammering this belief, and that is, everything starts with self-awareness, because when we don't have self-awareness, we believe these stories. We act as if these stories are true, and the rest is history. And so you have to have this self-awareness to be able to say, oh, I'm telling myself a story. And the story that I'm telling myself in this moment is that I'm not qualified. Here's the irony in all this, Dr. Pat. When I was invited to do this presentation for Koalas, my initial response was elation. I was excited. It was like, oh, I know what I'm going to say. And the closer the event came,
Right.
the louder the imposter feelings were. It's like, oh my God, I'm not qualified to do this. Who am I to do this? I had those conversations. And at the same time, I do practice what I preach. And I had a conversation with myself and I said, Charleanea, just take a step back. Let's look at this. Let's look at why you are the right person to have this conversation. And that was really helpful. And as a matter of fact, we're going to take a break right now. And what I'd like to do when we do come back is to talk about, well, what do we do when we have these feelings? How do we talk ourselves out of this? Because we both brought something up early in our conversation. The achievements don't matter. They're not going to talk us out of these feelings, because imposter feelings are not logical. They are emotional based.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk about this because years later, when Benny, my producer, my first show, Crust Busting, your show, found out that I was Dr. Pat, I never talked about my ed. I never talked about this, and started to call me Dr. Pat. The shock of hearing that on air. Don't say that, Benny. Don't call me that. Don't, and Benny is not going to listen. But why? Why does that still show up? And what have you and I done to realize that it's not even about playing small anymore, Dr. A? It's realizing that one of my coaches said to me, Pat, here's the deal. You have the ability to win the game of life, and you're playing not to lose. There's a very big difference. And imposter syndrome will do that. And it makes you think you're winning and you're not.
Right. Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will talk about what can you do with imposter feelings as they hijack you. You're listening to the Empowered Living Zone with Dr. A and Dr. Pat, and we'll be right back. We are back on the Empowered Living Zone with me, Dr. A, and Dr. Pat. Before we begin, I'd like to give you an opportunity, if you're interested in working with me, or you'd like to hear more about psychospiritual, transformational life coaching, or empowered living, you are welcome to reach out to me through my website, which is www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. So let's talk more about imposter syndrome. Dr. Pat, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I do want to give the listeners some golden nuggets about how to manage this. I think it's important to talk about the costs. And, you alluded to the costs with the different actors. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes on costs, because the costs are real. Because typically what you'll find is if individuals give in to the voice of this imposter fear, a lot of times what you'll see things like holding back, playing small, not contributing, being wallflowers, blending into the woodwork, but there's other things that happen. There are things like burnout because you're overworking, you're over preparing because you don't believe in your own abilities, or you don't take risks. You don't go for promotions. You might experience a lot of anxiety and depression, and you may isolate yourself for fear of being found out. So the costs are real. And I heard a number, a statistic, and it was from an organizational psychology perspective, and they were trying to estimate the cost to an organization with regard to imposter syndrome. And they came up with, I think the number was like for $34,000 per employee who struggled with imposter syndrome. So, you know, these are real costs, whether we look at them as personal and emotional, or we look at them as a bottom line in terms of dollar. They're definitely costs to imposter syndrome. And so, you know, what I'd like to kind of switch gears to is to talk about how you handle this. And I'm going to tell you the number one thing that is not the thing to do, because this is what people will do, and it does not work. Pep talks do not work. Telling somebody how wonderful they are, reminding them of all of their accomplishments and achievements, it doesn't work. Why does it not work? Because that's a logical, objective approach. And there's nothing about imposter syndrome that's logical, not a thing. And so that is not the route. That's not the route to go. So then what do you do with it? First and foremost, I've got it kind of a step-by-step process. First thing is label it. And what I mean by label it is you say to yourself, I am having imposter feelings right now. Why is it important to label it? Because the moment you label it, several things happen. There's a level of acceptance and acknowledgement. That's one thing. And you're normalizing it by doing that. The second thing that's also important is the moment you label the experience, you have just separated you and the experience. And when you separate it, you're no longer it. And you create the space for choice. So you can choose in that moment to either give into these feelings or have a different conversation with yourself. So that's really important. Second thing, have you ever heard the saying, what you resist persists? Okay. So resisting and pushing it away is not going to help. Instead, what you do is you actually come from a place of gratitude. Now, this is going to sound crazy. Why in the world would you be grateful for these feelings? Well, there's a reason why, because bottom line, these feelings are just trying to protect you. What are they trying to protect you from? We had the conversation around social media. We are trying to protect ourselves from rejection. We are trying to protect ourselves from humiliation. And so rather than judge these feelings or push these feelings away, it's important to not only label them, but to say, thank you. Thank you for trying to protect me. And I've got it covered. You don't need to protect me anymore. Okay. So I think that's really important. Yeah. The other thing is just to challenge your story. Challenge your story. You're telling yourself that you don't deserve a seat at the table. So rather than challenge yourself with, oh, well, look at all these things that I've done, what you can do is you can say, well, what about me? What is it that I have to offer that might be helpful? So sometimes what I have found, and I've done this with myself, is we can get in our own head. Our egos can get really activated. We're talking ourselves out of things. We're telling ourselves how we don't deserve to be in this moment. And what we can do is shift into service. It takes it away from self-focus into how can I help? What can I give? What can I contribute? What do I have to offer? That's a good way to shift out of this place of I'm not qualified. And not only that, another piece of this is really own where you are. I have this to offer, and I also have this to learn. I don't know it all, but I know this, and I can also be open to learning some new things. So sometimes that can help us out of that rigidity in thinking. Does that make sense, Dr. Pat?
It does. And I also want to mention something else that, this gets accentuated when you're in duress, when you're in a situation. So for me, after 24 and a half years in a job, career situation, which ended, even though I pretty much orchestrated that at a very unconscious, subconscious level, it was still hard. And so that's when this imposter syndrome can hit you, is when you're going through a life event. It doesn't have to be related to your self-esteem either, But when you're going through a life event, you would be surprised how hard it is, especially after job loss, to sit down and even do a resume. And what I want to say is, I know both of us, we believe in help. Reach out, work with Dr. A. You don't have to try to do this alone. I was not able to do this alone because, first of all, I didn't even understand what was going on. I didn't understand my thinking. I really didn't. And it wasn't until I worked with Dr. Juanita Lovett. And the way she broke it down was, Pat, I want you to think of every time in your life where you haven't been able to do something. Just write it down on a paper. And after a half hour, there was nothing on my paper. Nothing I could think of. She didn't ask me that you did good. She didn't do that. But what have you never been able to do that you want to do? Right? Just write anything down. Was there anything that you tried to do that you really want to do? And it was nothing. I couldn't put it down. And then I finally did come up with something, and that was stop stuttering. That was my big moment. I couldn't stop stuttering. Well, I couldn't. But what we're talking about is, people, please get some help. I think we need to really drive that message home, because it's one of those things that, yeah, you can do it on your own. Probably. I couldn't. And there are days I still can't. But boy, am I a lot more. See, you mentioned awareness is the first step. Action is the second. Isn't it?
And you know what the third is connection.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Connection.
We're not talking about social media dating this. I highly recommend you do not do that, because you may get some empathy from some people, but I guarantee you, no.
Yeah, social media gives the illusion of connection, and it is an illusion. It is not genuine connection. And connection is important. Connection is important. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that I recommend with when you're struggling with imposter feelings. Talk to somebody about it. It doesn't even have to be a professional. Talk to a loved one that you trust. Talk to a colleague, because when you bring it out into the open, what you do, and Brené Brown talks about this, she talks about shame. When you keep shame hidden, it just grows. It's like mold. It just grows. But when you bring it out into the open, into the light of day and around others, and you experience compassionate connection over this challenge, then the shame, it goes away, it dissipates. And what comes and takes its place is compassion, not only compassion from others, but it also cultivates your own compassion in that connection. And I think that's also really important. Yeah. Another thing to think about too, Dr. Pat, is, like when I was talking about my own imposter feelings coming up as I was getting ready to present, I shifted into service. I shifted into how can I help? And it took me away from those feelings. And at the same time, a lot, what can be helpful is to reframe the feelings. And reframe the feelings from the perspective that there's something missing in me, that I'm not hitting the bar. Instead, you say, whatever this is that I'm presented with must be really important to me, because it's stirring this up for me.
Yeah.
So you shift to the importance of the thing that you're invited toward, instead of ruminating in the fear of being found out that you're not good enough. Yeah. And that can be really helpful as well.
Yeah. Artists go through this ad nauseum. There's a reason why I don't show my art. I do show a couple of pieces, but we go through it as authors. I get asked, Pat, why aren't you written your book? Why aren't you written your book? You see, it just shows up in so many ways. But I'll tell you, Dr. A, what you're talking about today, people should be taking your phone number, and it should be off the hook right now, because it's so hard to even describe in a full hour show what the impact of this is. And it has grown exponentially, and it affects, I believe, women more than men. And so how do people find out about what you can do to work with them and help them with this? Let's make sure they know that.
Absolutely. And we're just about ready to bring the show to a close. But yeah, if anybody's interested in working with me one-on-one and we can address these imposter feelings, you are welcome to reach out to me through my website, which is www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's www.empoweredlivingcoaching.com. Stay tuned for the next podcast of the Empowered Living Zone. Join us every first and third Tuesday of every month at 12 p.m. Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a great week, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Empowered Living Zone show with me, Dr. A, to create the life you crave. Tune in on the first and third Tuesdays at noon Pacific Time on transformationtalkradio.com and get ready for another show. Say yes to creating positive and empowering change in your life and move beyond challenging terrain into the zone of success. Be ignited by spirit, fueled by purpose, and guided by vision in the Empowered Living Zone. For more information on how to do deep transformational work with me and to create the life you crave, visit empoweredlivingcoaching.com. That's empoweredlivingcoaching.com. See you next time.